What's up guys, how's it going? Welcome to another video here in the channel. Today, I'm going to talk about the case of Samantha Collins. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and don't forget to turn on notifications. Now without further ado, let's go to the video. Samantha Collins met Ian Borberly during a mutual friend's party in 2003 in Mississauga, Canada. At the time, Samantha was 25 and Ian was 28. The two were from completely different worlds. While Ian was born into a middle-class family, with caring and loving parents, Samantha was born into a poor family without any structure, being raised only by her mother, and never knew her father. Samantha became pregnant while still in high school. But instead of raising the child, she decided to relinquish custody of him by giving him up for adoption. Later, she turned to sell narcotics and working as a stripper in a club to earn a living. Ian, on the other hand, studied at one of the best colleges in the country, where he went to study physical education, which was his passion. After graduating, he moved to Toronto where he became a private fitness coach, getting a few jobs there. He was also a bodybuilder, and his friend described him as a cheerful with-time guy. But despite loving parents, good education and friends speaking well of him, Ian was bad news. Going back to the party where he met Samantha Collins in 2003, it is said that it was love at first sight. And as we all know, that hasn't been working out very well lately. The two started a relationship and it all went very fast. With a few days, Ian invited Samantha to move in with him. According to people close to them, the first few months of the relationship were just parties, drinks, and drugs. The two spent so much money on these parties that there was barely enough left over for the basic expenses, such as light and rent. With that, Ian got another job at a company that builds fences around houses, so he could supplement his income and have more left over for parties and drinks. He was later accused of stealing tools from a company that was neighboring the company he worked for. Afraid of being arrested, and also of being several months overdue rent, Ian packs everything he can, puts it in his car, and flees to his parents' house in Bracebridge, and Samantha goes with him. The police even issued a warrant for his arrest, but in the end nothing came of it. Ian's parents, George and Cindy Borberly, were happy to have their son home, but they didn't like Samantha one bit. George was quieter and too polite to say anything to his son. Cindy was more direct. She told her son that as soon as she laid eyes on Samantha, she saw that she was a bad influence on him. Ian ignored her, and just said that when she got to know Samantha better, she would like her. Shortly thereafter, Samantha became pregnant, and in May 2004, their son was born. After spending almost 1 year living at Ian's parents' house, the couple decided it was time to move, and have a place just for them and their son. They found a small apartment in the same city and moved in. Ian got a new job in construction, but the couple struggled to pay rent and care for their child. They also used to fight a lot, and aggression between them was frequent. When their son was just 4 months old, Samantha was arrested for assaulting Ian, who threatened to report her to a body that oversees child care. Ian said he was going to report her because Samantha didn't take good care of the child. Samantha spent one night in jail. After leaving, she returned to the apartment with Ian and the two continued as if nothing had happened. However, a few days later, they started arguing again, and Samantha threw a plate full of spaghetti at Ian's head. The couple's neighbors, unable to take the situation any longer, decided to inform the owner of the apartment, who, to get rid of them, offered $900 for the two to vacate the property. Ian and Samantha accepted. They then moved to another apartment on the outskirts of Bracebridge. Later, they were evicted for not paying rent and moved to a bungalow near a river called the Muskoka. Ian started working for a contractor named Jeremy Crees, usually doing renovations to cottages. Samantha, on the other hand, got a job as a waitress at a restaurant called the Purple Pig. She also sought help for her addiction. From the outside looking in, It looked like the couple was getting back on track. But the truth was, Samantha had had enough of Ian. She even started having affairs with several older men, some of whom Ian suspected and confronted. She also used to disappear for days at a time, coming home just to eat and get clothes, and then disappearing again. At this point, the couple's son was more with his paternal grandparents than with them. Afterwards, Samantha began to devise a plan to break up with Ian and take their child away with her. On March 19, 2007, she told her doctor that she was leaving town. 2 days later, she asked her addiction counselor to write her a letter testifying to her progress. Samantha intended to use this letter to ask for sole custody of her son. The couple, in addition to having their relationship in pieces, were also having huge financial problems. It is said that they owed over $3,000 in back rent. And if the landlord evicted them, they would have to move back with Ian's parents. On March 22, the two were due to appear at 9:30 a.m. in a courtroom to try to settle the rent. Ian woke up early to take his son to daycare, while Samantha stayed home to get ready. She made numerous calls, including one to her son's daycare, telling the staff not to let George nor Cindy pick him up later that day. Samantha decided she was ready to leave Ian and take her son with her. However, Ian returned home before she could leave without him noticing. Ian told her that his boss, Jeremy Grease, was going to give him a loan to help with the rent and maybe save them from being evicted. It was then that Samantha decided to review her plan to leave and take their son with her. Samantha also said that she couldn't save that life anymore, and it was already fed up with Ian, that she wanted to leave and start over with her son. Ian was furious. He started to break some things in the house and told her that she could leave but that their son would stay. Samantha was reluctant, said she would not leave without her son. She went to the child's room to try to get him, but Ian stopped her. Samantha, then realizing that she would not be able to take the child, decided to get some belongings and left alone, saying that sooner or later she would come back to get the child, and Ian could do nothing about it. After Samantha left, Ian decided to move on with his life. He took out the loan from his boss and paid the rent he owed. He told friends and family that Samantha had abandoned him and their child, and when they asked him where Samantha had gone, she would say a different place for each person. Sometimes he said she went west. Other times she went back to stripping. He told his parents that Samantha had moved back to Toronto. To some close friends, he said that Samantha had cleared out her bank account before she left, and that he wasn't sure where she went, but suspected she was in Oshawa, Hamilton, or Windsor. As for any employee at his son's daycare, he simply said that Samantha had abandoned him and would not return. He even told his mother, Cindy, that the day he told his son that Samantha had left them both, his son sat up and put his hand on his knees and said, "Don't worry that, we don't need her." In the following years, Ian raised his son with the help of his parents, who were used to being with the boy even when Samantha was around. It is said that the child is very attached to the grandparents and never minded spending time at their house. Friends and colleagues close to Ian told him that he looked better without Samantha, and that her leaving may have been a good thing. At work, things were going very well for Ian. His boss, Jeremy Grease, had won a 1.5-year contract to renovate a country house in Wook Lake, about 18.5 miles east of Bracebridge. This country home belongs to a renowned Toronto physician named Peter Vettis, who worked at St. Michael's. Jeremy assigned Ian to do the job with him. They managed to finish the job a little ahead of schedule, and Peter Vettis really liked it. In April 2009, Nicole, Samantha's sister, contacted Ian for news of her sister. According to her, Samantha has not been in touch since 2007, and her phone number only gave a P.O. box. Ian told Nicole that he also didn't hear from Samantha anymore, and that she left him and wouldn't come home anymore. Nicole was extremely worried. She started using social media in the hopes of finding her sister, but it was in vain. In May 2010, Peter Vettis found a large wooden box in a space below his cottage in Wood Lake, the same cottage that Ian had been working on renovating for over a year. The box was hidden behind a thin plywood slat. Peter realized that the box hadn't been there very long, that there was no dust, no cobwebs, and no signs of damage for seeping rainwater. Because he was so busy, the men ignored the box and eventually forgot about it. Only in July, almost 2 months later, Peter remembered the box. However, he was in Toronto. He then called his caretaker, a man named Norman Lintz, and asked him if he knew anything about that box and why it was under his cottage. Norman replied that he didn't know of any box, and asked Peter if he wanted him to open it when he went to the country house. Peter said he could open it, and depending on what was inside he could get rid of it. On July 5, 2010, Norman Lintz went to the cottage at Wood Lake. He took a crowbar and opened the box, and what he found inside was frightening. According to Norman, as soon as he opened the box he already smelled a strong smell of rotten meat. When looking inside, he saw 4 covered 20-liter plastic buckets, and as he lifted the lid of one of the buckets, he saw what looked like an arm. Very scared, Norman desperately called Peter Vadas, who then communicated the authorities. The police quickly arrived at the scene. They opened all the buckets and found that it was a human body divided into 12 parts. Because the corpse was practically sealed inside the buckets in the box, it was reasonably preserved, and with that, the forensic team was able to identify it through fingerprints. It was Samantha Collins. The coroner was unable to determine the time or even the year of death. Some of the organs had been removed, which made this job even more difficult. Finally, because there were no insights in the buckets, the coroner concluded that the crime occurred during the cold weather. Obviously, the cops followed Ian and asked him a lot of questions. At all times, he cooperated with the police and told them that Samantha had abandoned him, and that he had not known anything about her for years. But the police found it strange that her body was hidden in the very country house where Ian worked for a year and a half. To the police, this did not appear to be a mere coincidence. Peter Vadas used to rent his country house in high seasons, and this raised the hypothesis that perhaps whoever took Samantha's life put her body there on purpose to frame Ian. During investigations, the police discovered that Samantha had several lovers, so maybe one of them did this to her and then tried to blame it on Ian's back. Bracebridge is a small town where practically everyone knows each other. Ian knew of his partner's infidelity, and as I mentioned, he even confronted some of the men he suspected was dating her. It is not hard to believe that one of these men got angry and decided to get revenge on Ian. The police investigated the case for 10 months, and even though they found no physical evidence that Ian was responsible for the crime, he became the prime suspect. Later, authorities assumed that the crime took place around March 22, 2007. That's because after checking Samantha's phone records, they noticed that she made an average of 23 calls a day. And after March 22, her calls dropped to 10 a week, and the police found that all those calls were made by Ian. With that, the police tapped Ian's and his parents' phones. They also assigned a surveillance team to monitor all of their activities. By this time, Ian was living in a house in the town of Aurelia with his new girlfriend, a hairdresser who had children of her own. The policemen set up a strategy to find out if Ian was really responsible for the crime or not. They approached his girlfriend and told her that Ian was the prime suspect for the crime, and that if she knew something, she'd better tell them, otherwise she would get in trouble. At first, the woman said nothing, but then when the police were no longer around, she desperately called Ian, and their conversation confirmed that Ian was responsible for the crime. Remembering, the cops had tapped his phone, so they heard everything. Ian was arrested on May 2, 2011 while driving on the highway. But how did Ian take Samantha's life if she was gone? Well, that's what he told everyone and what he wanted everyone to believe. But the truth was different, and he confessed everything during his interrogation. On March 22, 2007, the day Samantha planned to leave and take her son with her, Ian arrived home early, frustrating his companion's plans. When Samantha told him that she wanted to leave him and leave with the couple's son, they had a violent fight. In the middle of the fight, Ian hit Samantha in the hand with a blunt object, and she couldn't resist. Afterwards, he cleaned up the crime scene and hid Samantha's body. The next day in the morning, after dropping his son off at a daycare, Ian met with his boss to get the loan he had applied for. With the money, Ian went to a department store and bought 4 plastic buckets of 20 liters and 4 matching lids. Then he drove about 30 minutes with Samantha's body in the trunk to an isolated cabin in the town of Huntsville. This cottage belonged to a man named Robert Colley. Ian was working for him on the renovation of the same cabin, and knew that the place was empty because Robert had traveled to Mexico with his wife. With no one to bother him, Ian took his time. He took Samantha out of the trunk and divided her into 12 parts, putting them in the 4 buckets he had bought. When he was finished, he cleaned up the place, put the buckets in the car, and drove home. In the following days, he told close friends and relatives that Samantha had abandoned him, and given the couple's troubled history, everyone believed him. Ian thought of a way of temporarily hide the buckets until he found a permanent place to put them. He then bought drugs and invited a friend named Mark Hill over to his apartment. Mark was an addict with an extensive criminal record, and Ian knew he had a warehouse in the town of Gravenhurst, the perfect place for him to temporarily store the buckets. While the two were doing drugs, Ian asked Mark if he could use his storage room to store the things Samantha had left after leaving him. Mark said fine, and that same week, Ian took the buckets to the warehouse, but didn't tell Mark what that was really about. Shortly thereafter, Ian and Jeremy Kreese began to work on the country house that belongs to the Dr. Peter Vadas, as I mentioned earlier. During construction, Ian began to divert some building materials, things he knew no one would miss. With these diverted materials, Ian built a wooden box of almost 2 meters square. His plan was to place the buckets of Samantha's remains in that box, and then bury her in some secluded spot. But Ian didn't, and it's not clear why. What is known is that as time passed, Ian became more erratic and sloppy. He sewed Samantha's clothes, and with the money he paid a debt he had because of narcotics, he used her personal cell phone until the account was cancelled for non-payment. And if that wasn't enough, he still used Samantha's dead card to pay for everything, from a barbecue to licensing his vehicle. The way he was going, it was only a matter of time before the police caught him. And as you know, they did. After Ian's arrest and the conclusion of the investigation, the police released details of the case to the media, which quickly released them to the public. People were shocked to hear about the whole plot, even more so those who knew Ian personally. For them, due to Samantha's history, everything led to believe that she would be the one to commit such a crime and not Ian. His parents were devastated. They, like everyone else, believed that Samantha really had left of her own free will, and that it somehow did their son good. But as I said, that's not what happened, and it was all in Ian's invention to throw people off something terrible he had done. A year 6 months after Ian's arrest, his trial began. The defense argued that the evidence the police had against him was not solid enough, and that they had nothing physical that could link him to the crime. The defense even put forward Jeremy Kreese, Ian's boss, as an alternate suspect, claiming he also had access to the country home where Samantha's remains were found. This allegation about Jeremy by the defense irritated the judge, because he understood that they were trying to accuse a man who had nothing to do with the story, and who even always helped Ian when he needed it. With that, the head of Ian's defense team, Michael McDonald, was ousted and replaced by a Toronto attorney named Paul Cooper. As soon as he took over the defense, Paul argued that Samantha had a dangerous lifestyle, and that she could have been the victim of one of her lovers. He further argued that it made no sense for Ian to hide Samantha's remains in a country house he worked on for over a year. For Paul Cooper, his client was innocent, and someone was trying to frame him. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Ian Borberly was found guilty of the crime against Samantha Collins and sentenced to life in prison. The child, the result of his relationship with Samantha, was taken care of by his paternal grandparents. I found no information regarding Samantha's family, other than the fact that her sister searched for her in 2009. Today, Ian is being held at Millhaven Maximum Security Prison and will only be eligible for parole when he turns 53. Alright folks, that's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end. Best wishes, and I see you next time.